They demanded war with humans, until their emperor was brought to ash and flame. The transmission arrived at 0400 station time, and it did not knock. It cut straight through every firewall, every encryption layer, every military frequency blocker on Conclave Station Meridian. One moment the screens were dark. The next, a face filled every display on the station, every corridor monitor, every officer terminal, every mess hall screen from Deck 1 to Deck 47. The face was not human. It was wide and pale as a chalk cliff, with 4 narrow eyes arranged in a vertical line down the center of a smooth, flat skull. The mouth, when it opened, showed no teeth. Only a dark, perfectly still interior, like looking into a well. I was sitting in the briefing room with Colonel Arden Webb and 2 junior analysts when it happened. My coffee mug was halfway to my mouth. I set it down without drinking. The voice that came out of the speakers was translated by the station's AI in real time. The words arrived in clean, clipped English, and every single one of them landed like a stone dropped from a great height. People of Earth and her colonies. I am Kethavar, first and eternal emperor of the Vorkai Ascendancy, sovereign of 47 systems, and the last authority you will ever need to address. You have been observed for 214 of your years. We have studied your wars, your failures, your brief and chaotic rise. We have concluded that you are useful but ungoverned. This ends today. You will surrender all colonial territories beyond your home system within 30 days. Your military infrastructure will be dismantled under Vorkai supervision. Your population will be reorganized into labor designations suited to your demonstrated capabilities. Resistance is not a choice available to you. It is merely a delay. The face on the screen did not blink once during the entire message. Not once. Then the feed cut out. Every screen on Meridian went dark at the same moment, as if someone had blown out a candle. Nobody in that briefing room moved for about 4 seconds. Then Arden said, very quietly, "Pull up the fleet data." The analyst to my left, a young man named Owen Carr, had his fingers moving before Arden finished the sentence. The tactical overlay bloomed across the central table. 612 Vorkai warships. They were sitting at the edge of our outer sensor range, arranged in a formation so precise it looked less like a military deployment and more like a piece of geometry. A statement. An architectural proof that they had already won. I looked at the formation for a long time. Something about it bothered me in a way I could not immediately name. The ships were enormous. Their weapons signatures were off the charts by any metric our analysts had. They outnumbered our combined colonial fleet by a ratio that made the junior analysts go very quiet. Everything about the display said that Kethavar had every right to be as calm as he appeared. And yet. They've done this before, I said. Arden looked at me. Done what? This exact deployment. This exact message structure. I pointed at the formation. Look at the spacing. Every ship is visible. No concealment, no flanking elements held in reserve, no sensor blackout screens. They want us to see all of them. They want the count to be the message. I turned to Owen. Pull the records on Vorkai first contacts. Every species they've absorbed. It took him 6 minutes. When the files came up, I did not need to read far. Every single species that the Vorkai Ascendancy had ever absorbed into its labor caste had surrendered within 22 days of receiving this exact style of ultimatum. The fleet display. The face on the screen. The 30-day window. It was not a military strategy. It was a ceremony. A ritual they had performed so many times that the outcome had stopped being a question and become an assumption. They had never once met a species that said no. Colonel Arden Webb leaned back in her chair. She was a tall woman with short gray hair and the kind of face that did not give much away under pressure. She had been in the service for 23 years. I had served under her for 6 of them. I had seen her in bad situations before, and I had learned to read her silences the way you learn to read weather. This silence was different. It was not the silence of a person calculating survival odds. It was the silence of a person deciding something. She looked at the formation on the display for a long moment. Then she looked at me. "Write the response," she said. 1 word. I looked at her. She nodded once. I sat down at the terminal. I opened a direct channel reply to the Vorkai flagship frequency, which our systems had automatically logged when the transmission came in. I typed a single word into the message field. I checked it once. I looked at Arden. She nodded again. I pressed send. No. The reply packet was logged at 0418 station time. I remember the exact minute because Owen Carr noted it in his log with the kind of clinical precision that young analysts use when they want to prove they are not afraid, even when their hands are shaking slightly. What happened next took 6 minutes. The Vorkai formation, all 612 ships, shifted. Not forward. Not into attack posture. They simply rearranged themselves, tightening slightly, like a fist closing. A second transmission came in, this one audio only. Kethavar's translated voice came through the speakers without the face this time. As if he could not quite believe he needed to repeat himself. You have been given one opportunity. It has been refused. You will be given no further consideration. Arden was already on the command line to Earth Central before the message finished. I could hear the connection tone. I could hear the background noise of a command center already awake, already running. They had seen the fleet data too. We heard, said the voice on the other end. General Patricia Morrow, commanding Earth's Unified Defense Council. Her voice was the flattest, most controlled sound I had ever heard come out of a human throat. Colonel Webb. What is your read on their immediate posture? They are waiting, Arden said. They expect us to reconsider. The window was 30 days. My read is they will not move for at least 72 hours. They have done this 11 times before and nobody has ever pushed back. They do not have a fast response protocol for this scenario because this scenario has never existed for them. A pause from the other end. 72 hours, General Morrow said. That is enough time. Yes, Arden said. It is. I did not fully understand what she meant until 48 hours later, when the first wave of deep penetration drone packages was already moving through subspace toward the outer edges of Vorkai supply corridors. While the Emperor waited for us to reconsider, we were already inside his walls. He had given us 30 days. We used 2 of them. There is something I have thought about many times in the years since that morning. When Kethavar sent that first transmission and watched it land on every screen in Meridian Station, he must have felt the way a person feels when they lay a winning hand on the table. The certainty of it. The comfortable weight of inevitability. He did not know, and could not have known, what it means to tell a human being that they have no choice. We are, at our core, the most stubborn creatures in the known galaxy. You can argue about our technology, our tactics, our biology. Reasonable people disagree on all of it. But no one who has ever studied us argues about that one simple fact. We do not accept the word never. We do not accept the phrase no option. We hear those words and something in us does not break. It sharpens. I have tried to explain this to alien colleagues over the years, and they always nod politely and then look slightly unsettled, as if I have just described something that should not be possible in a rational universe. One of our allies, a diplomatic officer from the Seri Confederation, said it best. We were sitting together at a negotiation table about a year after the war, reviewing historical records of the first contact moment. She studied the transmission record, the fleet formation, the response packet with its single word, for a long time. Then she looked at me and said, "Your entire species received a message that was designed to produce paralysis, and instead it produced focus. In 11 prior cases that message took an average of 9 days to achieve total compliance. You responded in 14 minutes. 14 minutes and change," I said. She shook her head slowly. We could not have done that. I thought about Arden Webb sitting in that briefing room with her coffee going cold, studying a fleet of 600 warships with that specific silence of hers, and deciding in less time than it takes to eat breakfast that the answer was going to be no. I know, I said to the Seri diplomat. That is the whole story, really. She thought about that. What is the story? I picked up my coffee. It was warm this time. We just never learned how to be afraid in the right direction, I said. Owen Carr was 26 years old, and he was already one of the best signals analysts I had ever worked with. He had a way of looking at raw data and finding the pattern before anyone else in the room had finished reading the summary. In the weeks after the Vorkai ultimatum, that ability became more valuable than anything else on the station. On day 3, he came into my office with a tablet and a look on his face that I had learned to recognize. Not excitement, exactly. More like a person who has just found a door they were not expecting to find. He set the tablet down in front of me. On it was a map of Vorkai logistical routing across their occupied territories. 6 weeks of intercepted supply chain data, stitched together by our AI analysis systems into something coherent. They move in cycles, Owen said. Every resupply convoy follows one of 8 fixed routes. They have not varied these routes in the entire recorded period of our observation. Not once. I looked at the map. Why not? Best I can tell, it is status. The routes were established by the Emperor's Logistics Command 3 generations ago. Changing them would imply that the original design was imperfect. And nothing the Emperor approves is permitted to be imperfect. I stared at the routes for a moment. So the most powerful fleet we have ever encountered moves its supplies along roads that never change. Yes. And we know every road. Owen nodded. Every single one. That was day 3. By day 7, the first automated drone strike packages had already disabled 4 Vorkai relay stations deep in their logistics corridor. Not destroyed. Disabled. That distinction mattered enormously to the people who planned it, and it took me a little while to understand why. I found out when I sat in on the strategic planning session with Commander Vera Lane, who led our Special Operations Development Group. Vera was a compact, quiet woman who spoke slowly and chose every word with the precision of someone who had learned the hard way that imprecision costs lives. She had a background in infrastructure disruption, which is a polite term for making complex systems fall apart without leaving obvious fingerprints. She stood at the front of the planning room and explained the philosophy in about 4 sentences. We are not trying to defeat them in a straight fight. Not yet. We are trying to confuse them first. A confused enemy makes mistakes. A confused enemy with pride makes catastrophic mistakes. We are going to make the Vorkai military command look incompetent to their own emperor, and we are going to do it so quietly that they will not know who to blame. Someone at the back of the room asked the obvious question. What does that accomplish? Vera looked at the person who asked the question with the patience of someone explaining gravity. It means they will start blaming each other. The moment their command structure starts looking inward for fault, they stop looking outward at us. That is when we move. What followed over the next several weeks was, from the outside, almost invisible. Supply convoys arrived late. Communication relays on the outer edges of Vorkai territory began returning corrupted data. 2 of their forward operating bases received incorrect fuel loads because someone had quietly altered the automated requisition codes at the source depot. Nothing exploded. Nobody was dramatically confronted. Things simply stopped working, in the way that complex systems stop working when someone who understands them has been patient and methodical and very, very quiet. The Vorkai military command, as predicted, began to fracture internally. I read the intercepted internal communications later. They were, in their own way, remarkable. Admirals accused logistics officers. Logistics officers blamed the relay station technicians. Technicians filed formal complaints about their admiral's incompetence. All of it filtered up toward the Emperor's command council, where it sat like a stone in still water, sending ripples in every direction. Meanwhile, our actual combat forces were not sitting still. I was attached to the 1st Deep Strike Group when they hit the Vorkai staging depot at coordinates our side called Point Narrow. It was not a glorious engagement. It was not the kind of thing that gets turned into a story that people tell at dinner tables. It was 4 hours of precise, ugly, efficient work. Captain Daniel Holt led the strike, and watching him operate was like watching someone who had removed the concept of waste from their decision-making entirely. Every order he gave had a reason. Every position was chosen for a purpose. His team moved through the depot like a system, not a group of individuals, and when they came out the other side the depot's power infrastructure would not function properly for 11 months. On the way back to the carrier, I was sitting across from a soldier named Cora Ellis. She was 29. She had a cut above her eyebrow that the medic had already sealed. She was eating a ration bar with the calm focus of someone doing something that needed doing. I asked her what she thought about all of it. The war. The Vorkai. The fact that 6 months ago she had been stationed on a quiet outpost doing maintenance rotations and now she was dismantling the supply infrastructure of the most powerful empire in the known galaxy. She considered the question for a moment. "I think they got us wrong," she said. "How so?" "They watched us for 200 years and figured out what we are afraid of." "Fair enough. But they didn't figure out what happens when we decide the fear doesn't matter anymore." She took another bite of the ration bar. "Once we made that call, everything else was just logistics." That struck me as the clearest description I had heard of what was actually happening. Because the Vorkai had built their entire strategy around the assumption that fear would function as a leash. Show us enough force and we would stop moving. What they had not modeled, could not have modeled, because they had no data for it, was what happens when an entire species decides, collectively and individually, that the leash is not attached to anything real. The fear was there. Nobody pretended otherwise. People were afraid every single day. Arden Webb was afraid. Vera Lane was afraid. Cora Ellis, eating her ration bar with her sealed eyebrow cut, was almost certainly afraid. Daniel Holt, the most operationally precise human being I had ever met, was afraid. We just kept moving anyway. In the 4th week of operations, we captured a Vorkai war priest. He was part of a ceremonial command staff aboard a mid-tier warship that our forces had disabled and boarded. He was not a combatant in the traditional sense. His role was to perform the ritual rites that the Vorkai military required before and after engagements, a position that had existed in their military structure for over 400 years. He was brought aboard our carrier under a prisoner protocol and placed in a secure but comfortable room with a translation unit. Our intelligence officer, a methodical man named George Alderton, conducted the initial interview. I was present as an observer. The war priest was not hostile. He was bewildered. He sat across the table from George with the expression of someone who has arrived at a destination that should not exist on any map they have ever seen. George asked him the standard orientation questions. Rank. Position. Command structure. The war priest answered them accurately and without hesitation. Then George asked him a broader question. Do you understand why you are here? The war priest thought about this. Your forces disabled our vessel and took prisoners. I understand the mechanism. I do not understand the motivation. In our doctrine, disabling a vessel of this class serves no strategic purpose. The resources required are disproportionate to the value of the target. We disagree, George said. Clearly. The war priest studied George with all 4 of his narrow eyes. What I do not understand is why you continue. You have lost 3 colonial outposts in this conflict. Each loss represents population, infrastructure, years of development. How do your people continue to function after losses of that magnitude? Do you not mourn your dead? George looked at him for a moment without expression. Then he glanced at me. I leaned forward. Every single one, I said. That is why we are still here. The war priest looked at me as though I had said something in a language his translator was having difficulty processing. His 4 eyes moved from my face to George's face and back again, as if checking whether we were serious. He did not say anything further for the remainder of that session. But later, when George reviewed the session recordings, he noted something in his report that stayed with me for a long time afterward. He wrote, the subject appears to have encountered a concept for which his cultural framework has no existing category. He is not dismissing what he was told. He is trying to build a new box to put it in. This is going to take him some time. It struck me as one of the most honest descriptions of the entire war. The Vorkai had a box for every situation. A ritual for every outcome. A category for every enemy they had ever encountered. We simply did not fit in any of them. And while they worked to understand us, while they argued internally and blamed each other and tried to find the familiar pattern in something that had no familiar pattern, we kept moving. We pushed deeper into their supply network. We documented their patrol cycles. We mapped their communication infrastructure. We identified every fixed point in their logistics chain and we noted which ones could be disrupted and which ones could not and in what order disruption would cause the most cascading confusion. None of this was fast. None of it was clean. It was slow, grinding, careful work. People were hurt. People were lost. Each loss left a mark on every person who had served with them, and those marks did not fade. We carried them. But here is the thing about grief that the Vorkai had clearly never considered. Grief does not stop motion. It does not paralyze the people who carry it. Not in the way the Vorkai expected. Not in the way every previous species they had encountered apparently experienced it. In us, grief does something different. It clarifies things. It burns away whatever was not essential and leaves behind only the thing that matters most. And what mattered most, to every soldier and analyst and engineer and officer in that conflict, was that what happened to the people we lost would not happen to anyone else. That is not fury. It is not recklessness. It is something much quieter and much more dangerous. It is purpose. By the end of the second month, 3 alien civilizations that had been observing the conflict from careful neutrality had quietly sent diplomatic contacts to our command leadership. None of them had formally allied with the Vorkai. None of them had formally allied with us. They were watching. Taking notes. Trying to understand what they were seeing. One of those diplomatic contacts, from a species called the Tyran, sent a message through unofficial channels to Admiral Grace Osei, who commanded our combined naval operations. The message was brief. It said, more or less, we expected this conflict to conclude within 30 days. It has not concluded. We are revising our analysis. Admiral Osei sent a reply that was equally brief. She said, your analysis assumed we would behave the way the Vorkai expected us to behave. We did not. Adjust accordingly. The Tyrant did not respond immediately. But 4 weeks after that exchange, they voted at the Conclave Assembly to formally recognize humanity's right to self-determination under interstellar law. It was not a military alliance. It was something more subtle. It was the first admission, from a previously neutral party, that the outcome of this conflict was not as settled as the Vorkai had declared. Small things matter in wars like this. They matter enormously. I remember sitting in the operations room the night that vote came through and watching the analysts around me exchange glances. Nobody cheered. Nobody made a speech. Daniel Holt, who had come back from a second strike operation and was reviewing mission debrief notes, simply looked up at the display, nodded once, and went back to his notes. But Cora Ellis, sitting 3 seats to my left, said quietly, they're starting to see it. See what? I asked. She looked at the display showing the Tyran vote. Then she looked at the tactical overlay showing our current positions deep inside what the Vorkai had considered secure territory 3 months ago. That we're not stopping, she said. She was right. We were nowhere near stopping. We had barely started. On the 43rd day of the conflict, the Vorkai Emperor made a decision that changed everything. I was not in the operations center when the first reports came in. I was in a medical bay on Carrier Group 7, being treated for a pressure injury to my left ear from an operation that had not gone exactly as planned. The medic, a calm and efficient man named Philip Cross, had just finished his examination and was explaining what the recovery protocol would look like when Owen Carr appeared in the doorway. I knew from his face before he said a word. Callisto Station, Owen said. He ordered the bombardment 40 minutes ago. Philip stopped talking. I sat up on the examination table. How many? I said. Owen looked at his tablet. He looked at me. He looked at the tablet again, as if hoping the number would change. 4.2 million, he said. Philip Cross set down his instruments. He did it very carefully, placing them precisely on the tray beside him, the way you handle something when your hands want to shake but you are not going to let them. I said nothing for a long time. There are moments when words are just noise, and this was one of them. Callisto Station was not a military installation. It had a small defense garrison, standard for any colonial infrastructure hub, but it was primarily a civilian population center. A transit hub, a manufacturing district, 4 residential rings, a university. It had been established for 60 years. 3 generations of families had grown up there. Kethavar had not targeted it because it posed a military threat. He had targeted it because he needed a demonstration. The war was not going the way his war priests and admirals had projected. The ritual had not produced the expected result. The humans had not broken in the first month, had not requested negotiations in the second month, and were now operating inside supply corridors that were supposed to be impossibly secure. He needed to remind us that he had options we did not. He was right about that part. He had options we did not have. His fleet could reach civilian targets that our defenses could not fully cover. He had demonstrated that in the most brutal possible way. What he had not calculated was the response. I have tried, many times, to describe what happened in the 48 hours after the Callisto bombardment became known across Earth and her colonies. It is difficult to describe accurately because what happened was not a single event. It was a shift. Like a tide moving. Like a temperature change in a very large room. Not fast, not loud, not dramatic. Just a collective and irreversible change in the state of things. The civilians on colonies that had been considering appeals for negotiated settlement went quiet. The political voices that had been calling for a diplomatic channel fell silent, not because they were silenced, but because they looked at what had happened and concluded that the framework they had been operating in no longer applied. Callisto Station was gone. 4.2 million people were gone. There was nothing left to negotiate about, because what the Emperor had just demonstrated was that he did not consider those lives to be a factor in any calculation. And when you tell a people that the lives of their families are not a factor, you do not produce surrender. You produce something far more focused. Admiral Grace Osei convened an emergency command session 6 hours after the event. I attended via communication relay, still in the medical bay, Philip Cross having decided that sending me back to active duty with a damaged ear was not something he was prepared to authorize regardless of the circumstances. Osei did not make a speech. That was not her style. She pulled up the strategic map and spoke for 11 minutes in the same flat, direct tone she used for every briefing. She identified 4 new operational priorities. She assigned resources. She set timelines. She asked twice if anyone had questions or objections. Nobody did. At the end she said one thing that was not on the official briefing document. What he intended to teach us was that resistance has a price. What he has actually taught us is that there is no cost high enough to buy the outcome he wants. I want every unit to carry that understanding into every operation from this point forward. We are not responding to Callisto. We are concluding it. The session ended. The assignments went out. I lay in the medical bay and listened to the ship around me, the low hum of systems, the distant sounds of a carrier preparing to operate at full capacity, and I thought about something that I had noticed in the faces of the people in that briefing. Before Callisto, there had been fear in those faces. Controlled, professional, well-managed fear. The kind that soldiers carry because they are honest about what they are doing. After Callisto, the fear was still there. But it had been joined by something else, something that sat alongside it and did not replace it but changed its character. The best word I have for it is resolve. Not the dramatic, fist-clenching kind you see in stories. The quiet kind. The kind that does not need to announce itself because it is not going anywhere. Commander Vera Lane spent the next 72 hours without sleeping, as far as anyone could tell. She redesigned 3 ongoing operations from the ground up, incorporating new targeting priorities that had been approved in the aftermath of the command session. Her team worked alongside her in the same sustained, quiet way, because they understood what they were working toward and the understanding was enough. Daniel Holt requested and received authorization for a strike package that had previously been considered too complex to execute with current resources. With the new operational footing, the resource calculation changed. He submitted the revised plan at 3 in the morning. It was approved by 6. Owen Carr, who had been pulling extended analysis shifts since before Callisto, came to see me in the medical bay on the second day. He sat in the chair beside the examination table and handed me a sealed debrief summary to review. While I read it, he was quiet. After a while he said, "Do you think he understood what he was doing?" I looked up. "Kethavar," Owen said. "When he gave that order. Do you think he understood the effect it would have on us?" I thought about it. He understood the effect it had on every other species he has ever done it to. Owen nodded slowly. They stopped fighting. They stopped fighting, I confirmed. Because for them, the loss was a signal. It told them the cost of continuing was too high. Yes. Owen looked at his hands. He didn't know that for us, the loss is also a signal. Just a different one. Philip Cross, who was checking supply inventory at the far end of the bay and had apparently been listening, did not look up from his clipboard. But he said, quietly, different signal. Same direction. I looked at him. He made a small note on his clipboard and kept working. That, I think, is what the Vorkai Emperor never understood, and perhaps could never have understood. He had spent centuries absorbing species for whom loss and surrender belonged to the same emotional category. For whom a sufficient demonstration of superior force resolved the question of whether to continue. He had optimized his entire strategic doctrine around that assumption. It worked. It worked 11 times, on 11 different species, across 400 years of expansion. It just happened to be catastrophically wrong about us. By the end of that third week after Callisto, two things had happened that shifted the political landscape of the conflict permanently. The Tyran, who had previously only offered legal recognition, sent a formal military liaison to Admiral Osei's command. They did not commit forces. But they made their communication channels available, and they began sharing intelligence on Vorkai movements through their observation territory. It was a small commitment. But it was public, and it was irreversible. The second development was more significant. The Haravan Compact, a civilization that had been a formal client state of the Vorkai ascendancy for 60 years, requested a private communication with Earth's diplomatic channel. Their message was carefully worded, but its meaning was unmistakable. They wanted to know if humanity would be willing to discuss the terms under which they might withdraw their support from the ascendancy. I read the transcript of that initial Haravan contact 3 times when it crossed my desk. What struck me most was a single phrase buried near the middle of the document. The Haravan diplomatic representative wrote, "We have observed, over the past months, that the ascendancy's certainty regarding the outcome of this conflict does not appear to be shared by the conflict itself." That sentence, written in the careful, formal language of interstellar diplomacy, was one of the most honest assessments of the war I had read from any source. The ascendancy's certainty regarding the outcome does not appear to be shared by the conflict itself. We were the conflict. And they were right that we did not share the certainty. We had a different certainty entirely. I had been in tight places before, but the Eternal Citadel was not like anything I had prepared for. We had been in the Vorkai home system for 9 hours when the outer cordon fell. Our combined strike force moved through the debris field of what had been their primary defense perimeter and headed for the planet below. The planet's surface was visible through the viewport of our transport, and it was genuinely one of the most extraordinary things I had ever seen. The Vorkai had been building their homeworld for 1,000 years. The continents were layered in concentric rings of architecture that rose toward the sky in tiers, each one more elaborate than the last, the whole thing lit from below by energy distribution systems that made the night side of the planet glow like an ember. A civilization that had built itself to last forever. From our altitude, I could also see the places where it was burning. Our fleet had been at work for 6 hours before our unit dropped into the atmosphere. The outer defense installations were gone. The orbital weapons platforms had been cleared. What remained was the planet itself, and the planet was defended in the old way. On the ground. In the streets. In the corridors of structures that had stood for centuries. I commanded the Special Operations Unit designated for the Citadel itself. We were 43 people. Most of us were human. 6 were Haravan soldiers, recently transferred from units that had defected from Vorkai service 4 months earlier. 2 were from a small species called the Ven, who had joined the Allied coalition after Callisto and had been requesting frontline deployment ever since. We were dropped 3 kilometers from the Citadel's outer wall. The first kilometer was quiet in the way that quiet is its own kind of message. The streets were empty. The civilian population had been evacuated inward by Vorkai command, toward the protected interior districts. The outer district buildings were closed and dark. Our boots on the stone made the only sound. Lieutenant Nora Finch was walking on my left. She had been with my unit since the early days of the campaign and had become, in the quiet way these things happen, someone I relied on to see the things I might miss. She was observant in a fundamental way, the kind of person who notices which door opens inward and which opens outward before they reach for the handle. She said, in a low voice, "Too quiet for an ambush. Too organized for a retreat." Meaning? I said. Meaning they pulled back on purpose. They want us inside the perimeter before they engage. Choke points. I nodded. I had reached the same conclusion. Alternate route. Already mapped, she said, and handed me her tablet without breaking stride. We went through the service corridor network beneath the outer district, through passages that had been built to move maintenance equipment and supplies. They were narrow enough that we moved single file for long stretches. They were also completely off the standard military defensive map, because the Vorkai military command had not thought to secure them. Why would they? These were service passages. Servants' routes. What the Vorkai had not considered, perhaps because it was outside their framework, was that a small human unit with good intelligence would not go where the fighting was expected. We would go where it was not. We entered the Citadel's inner structure through a maintenance access point at the base of the eastern residential tier. From there, Nora's map guided us upward through 2 floors of service corridors, into the administrative district, and from there toward the throne complex. We encountered resistance at the administrative corridor junction. It was a formal guard post, not a quick deployment, 8 Vorkai soldiers in full ceremonial armor positioned to defend the access point. They were trained and disciplined and they held their ground. I will not describe the details of the fight. I will say that it was short, that it was serious, and that we lost 2 people there. Nathan Cole, who had been with us from the campaign's 3rd month. And a young Haravan soldier named Priv, who had volunteered for this specific operation because he wanted, as he had explained to me once in careful translated words, to see what it looked like when the thing you had been afraid of your whole life was finally brought to an end. We carried them with us. We did not leave them. Past the junction, the remaining path to the throne complex required us to pass through the Citadel's ceremonial hall. It was an enormous space, tall as a cathedral, built from dark stone and lit by suspended energy fixtures that cast everything in a cold, pale light. The floor was engraved with the Vorkai imperial record, a history of the ascendancy written in their script, spiraling outward from the center in expanding rings. Every victory. Every absorption. Every species that had bent before the eternal emperor. The record spiraled outward a long way. Nora looked at it as we moved through. Not much room left, she said quietly, nodding at the outer edges of the inscription where the text thinned out toward blank stone. No, I agreed. Maybe they were running out of space. Or maybe they were not planning on stopping. She looked at the blank stone at the edge of the inscription and then looked away. We kept moving. The throne room doors were open. That was the first unexpected thing. They were the largest doors I had ever seen on a structure intended for use by living beings, heavy reinforced panels of dark metal etched with the imperial seal, and they stood fully open as if the room inside was waiting for visitors. Kethavar was waiting. He was alone except for a personal guard of 12, arranged in 2 lines flanking the throne. The throne itself was elevated on a platform of tiered stone, broad and high and clearly designed to produce a specific effect in whoever stood before it. The effect, I noted, worked better on species that were shorter than us. The Emperor was in full ceremonial war armor. It was extraordinary craftsmanship. Centuries of design and refinement had gone into it. He looked, in that armor, like something built rather than born. For narrow eyes fixed on me as I entered the room with my unit fanned out behind me. He waited for a moment. Then he spoke. The translation unit at my collar rendered it in clear English. "You will kneel," he said. There was no heat in the words. No urgency. He said it the way you state a physical law. The same way he had delivered the original ultimatum. With the absolute certainty of someone who had said this to countless beings before and had always been obeyed. I stopped walking. I looked at him. He looked at me. "We did not come here to kneel," I said. "We came here to end this." He was silent for a moment. Then he raised one hand. His guard moved. What followed was the hardest 17 minutes of my life. The guard were not ceremonial soldiers. The armor was ceremonial. The soldiers inside it were not. They were the best the Vorkai military had, selected from the entire Ascendancy's forces to protect the person of the Emperor, and they fought with the concentrated ferocity of people who understood exactly what was at stake. My unit fought back with the concentrated ferocity of people who understood exactly what was at stake. Nora Finch held the left side of the room with 3 others against a flanking press that should have broken us. It did not break us because she would not let it. She moved in that fight the way she moved in every situation, with a complete absence of wasted motion, like someone who had already thought 6 steps ahead and was merely executing a plan. Captain Daniel Holt, who had joined our unit for this final operation, fought in the middle of the room with the same operational precision he brought to everything, calling adjustments in a low voice that carried even in the noise, keeping the unit's response coordinated even as the situation shifted. The Haravan soldiers, fighting the former masters who had held their civilization in subjection for 60 years, brought something to that fight that I do not have a precise word for. It was focused. It was very personal. And it did not stop. We lost one more person in that room. Lee Santos, who had been one of the quietest members of our unit and one of the most dependable. I will not say more about it here because the details belong to people who were closer to him than I was. At the end of those 17 minutes, the Emperor was alone. He stood before his throne and looked at the room around him. His guard was down. His citadel had been entered. His defenses had been cleared by a fleet he had believed could never reach his home system. And standing in front of him was a unit of 40 people, some of them human, some of them species that had once been subordinate to his will, all of them still standing. He looked at me for a long time. I looked back. There was something in his expression, in all 4 of those narrow eyes, that I had not seen there before. Not fear, exactly. More like recognition. The specific, quiet recognition of a moment when everything you assumed about the nature of the world has been shown to be wrong. This is not possible, he said. We heard that before, I said. A long time ago. At the beginning of all this. He looked at the room again. At the members of my unit. At the Haravan soldiers standing among us. At the 2 Ven fighters, small and quiet and utterly composed. You are not what we calculated, he said. No, I agreed. We are not. The throne room burned that night, as the Citadel's energy systems, struck by our fleet's final pass over the complex, released in a cascade that the Vorkai engineers had always claimed was impossible. Nothing in that building was supposed to be flammable. Everything burned. We were already outside when it happened. The whole unit, every person who had walked in, minus the 3 we carried, stood on the elevated approach terrace of the Citadel and watched the building collapse inward on itself in a pillar of light and heat that was visible from 300 kilometers away. Nora stood beside me. After a while she said, "Is it over?" I thought about that. "This part of it," I said. She nodded. She looked at the fire. Then she looked at the sky, where the remaining Vorkai defense fleet was, by all reports, surrendering in sections to our combined command. "What happens next?" she said. "Something different," I said. She thought about it. Then, quietly, "Good." I do not remember which year the memorial was finally completed. Not because I have forgotten, but because time does things to memory that are difficult to describe. The years between the end of the conflict and the signing of the Conclave Accords were dense years, full of the complicated and unglamorous work of what comes after a war. Negotiations, reconstruction, the slow reassembly of political frameworks that had been shaken loose by the conflict. The kind of work that does not make the stories people tell, but makes the stories possible. I was present at the signing. It was held on a neutral station, Conclave Meridian, the same station where the original ultimatum had been received, which felt intentional to someone on the planning committee. The ceremony was long. There were speeches, some of them very good and some of them very long, and there were formal readings and procedural declarations and all the careful architectural work of making something permanent with words and signatures. I sat in the observer gallery with Owen Carr, who was now a senior intelligence director and had the slightly tired, deeply competent look of someone who has spent years solving problems that most people do not know exist. He was 34 years old and had more operational experience than people twice his age. Beside me on the other side was Nora Finch, who had left active service 18 months earlier and had spent the intervening time doing something she had mentioned wanting to do once, briefly, in a conversation we had on the transport back from the Citadel. She was teaching secondary school physics and mathematics to 12 and 13-year-olds on a colony that had been rebuilt after sustaining damage early in the conflict. When I had asked her about it, she had shrugged and said, "Someone needs to explain to the next generation what's out there. Better they hear it from someone who was there." Daniel Holt was not at the ceremony. He had retired from active service shortly after the final operations concluded, and had, according to the last communication I received from him, moved to a small agricultural settlement on a colony called Heron's Point, where he was apparently growing vegetables with the same operational precision he had brought to everything else in his life. His neighbor had reportedly described him as the most organized farmer they had ever encountered. I thought about him often. Admiral Grace Osei was at the ceremony, seated on the main floor with the senior military delegation, her back straight and her expression composed. She had aged in the years since the conflict began, in the way that people who carry significant weight age. Not dramatically. Just with a quality of settled gravity, as if the experiences had become part of her physical structure. Commander Vera Lane was also present. She had not retired. She was still active, still working in infrastructure and logistics planning, now focused on rebuilding rather than disruption. She had told me once, near the end of the conflict, that she found peace in the fact that the skills required to take something apart were the same skills required to put something back together. Just applied in the opposite direction. Philip Cross, the medic who had told me not to return to duty with a damaged ear and had been absolutely right to do so, had gone back to civilian medicine. He ran a practice on Earth now, I had heard. General medicine. Very ordinary, very quiet work. I imagined he was good at it. Lee Santos and Nathan Cole and Priv and the others who did not come back from the Citadel or from the 100 other operations across the years of that conflict were remembered at the ceremony in the way that the dead are remembered at such occasions. Their names were read. A silence was observed. Then the proceedings continued, as proceedings always continue, because that is the nature of peace. It requires the living to keep moving. I did not find the ceremony itself difficult. What I found difficult was the corridor immediately after it. The formal session ended and the delegates moved from the main floor to a reception hall. I was walking through the secondary corridor, one of those transitional spaces that exist between the formal and the informal in large official buildings, when someone stepped into my path. She was young. Perhaps 20 years old. Vorkai. She was wearing a diplomatic trainee's identification, which placed her as part of the new Vorkai Transitional Government's Observer Delegation, a group of young officials being educated in the processes of interstellar governance under conclave oversight. She was shorter than the Vorkai soldiers I had encountered during the conflict. Her 4 eyes were a lighter color than I was used to. She looked, standing there in the corridor in her official identification lanyard, less like a representative of the most powerful empire in the known galaxy and more like a student who had arrived early to an event and was working out where she was supposed to stand. She said my name. She had clearly been waiting for me. I stopped. I wanted to speak with you, she said, through her translation unit. If you have a moment. I have been told you were at the Citadel. I was, I said. She seemed to gather herself. My name is Sarah Veth. I am studying diplomatic history. The conflict is one of my primary research areas. She paused. I know that sounds strange. A Vorkai studying it. Not strange, I said. Necessary. She nodded, and something in her posture relaxed slightly, as if she had been holding herself ready for a different response. My people have a word. It was coined after the conflict. We did not have it before. She thought for a moment, working out the translation. The closest rendering is something like the thing that grows stronger when you break it. Or perhaps the thing that becomes more of itself under pressure. The precise meaning is layered. I waited. I wondered, she said carefully, whether you think that word describes your people. Whether it is accurate. I looked at her for a moment. Behind me, through the corridor, I could hear the reception hall filling with the sound of voices and movement, the ordinary sound of people gathering after something significant to talk about what had happened and what would come next. I thought about Arden Webb, sitting in a briefing room in the early hours of the morning, deciding in the space of a few minutes that the answer to an ultimatum from 600 warships was going to be no. I thought about Owen Carr, 26 years old, finding the pattern in 6 weeks of supply chain data that nobody else had seen. I thought about Cora Ellis eating a ration bar with a sealed cut above her eyebrow and explaining the war in 3 sentences better than most official analyses had managed in 300 pages. I thought about Nora Finch holding the left flank of a throne room fight with 3 other people against a force that should have overwhelmed them, moving through it with that fundamental, uncategorizable efficiency of someone who has already calculated 6 steps ahead. I thought about Lee Santos and Nathan Cole and Priv, who did not come back, and about the weight of that, which does not lift and is not supposed to lift, because if it lifted it would mean we had stopped caring, and stopping would be the beginning of becoming something else, something smaller. I thought about all of it, the whole dense complicated thread of it, all the way from that cold briefing room at 0400 to this corridor, to this young woman with her 4 pale eyes and her diplomatic lanyard and her question. I looked at the wall for a moment. Then I looked at her. "We are still figuring that out," I said. She looked at me. "That is not a no," she observed. "No," I agreed. "It is not." She thought about that. "May I ask what you believe the answer is?" "Not officially. Personally." I considered the question honestly, because it deserved honesty. "I think the word your people invented is close," I said. "But it is missing something." "What is missing?" I thought about Arden. About Owen. About everyone in that corridor of years between the first transmission and this one. "The part where we choose it," I said. "It is not just something that happens to us. It is something we decide. Every time. Deliberately. That is the part that is hard to put in a word, because it is not a quality you observe from the outside. It is a decision made on the inside, over and over, in every moment when the easier choice would be to stop." Sarah Veth was quiet for a moment. She was looking at me with an expression I could not entirely read, but which seemed like something between consideration and recognition, the same look the war priest on the carrier had worn when he was trying to build a new box for something that did not fit in any existing one. "I will include that in my research," she said carefully. "Good," I said. We stood there in the corridor for another moment. Through the walls I could hear the reception hall, the voices of diplomats and soldiers and analysts and commanders from a dozen species, talking in the way that people talk when they are beginning, cautiously, to believe that what comes next might be better than what came before. Sarah Veth said, "Thank you for speaking with me." "Thank you for asking," I said. She gave a small, formal inclination of her head, which I understood was a Vorkai gesture of respectful acknowledgement. Then she moved on down the corridor toward the reception hall. I stood there for a moment longer. I thought about the word she had brought. The thing that grows stronger when you break it. Then I thought about the decision. The one made at 0418 station time on the morning this all started, in a dark briefing room with cold coffee and a tactical display showing 600 warships. The one made in every operation after that, by every person who had carried it forward. The decision to keep moving. Not because it was painless. Not because it was certain. Not because there was no cost. But because the alternative was to become something less than what we were. Owen Carr appeared at the end of the corridor, looking for me with the slight impatience of someone who has been asked to keep the reception line in order and is discovering that this is not as easy as it sounds. "There you are," he said. "Osei wants to introduce you to the Heravan delegation formally. They specifically requested it." "On my way," I said. He fell into step beside me. We walked toward the hall. "How are you doing?" Owen asked, in the sideways way that he asked things he actually wanted to know the answer to. I thought about the corridor conversation. About Sarah Veth's question and the answer I had given, and whether it was the right one or whether there was a better one that I would think of later, as you always think of better answers later. "Good," I said. "I am good." Owen accepted this. He was quiet for a few steps. Then, in the same sideways voice, he said, "Do you ever think about that morning? The first one. When the transmission came in?" "Yes," I said. "Often." "What do you think about?" I thought about what to say. "I think about how 14 minutes was enough time," I said. "To decide the whole thing." Owen nodded slowly. "Do you think it would have gone differently if someone different had been in that room?" I thought about Arden Webb, sitting in her chair, looking at 600 ships on a display, deciding. "No," I said. "I do not think it would have." "Why not?" We reached the entrance to the reception hall. Through the open doors I could see the gathering of people, the delegates and officers and diplomats from more species than I could count off the top of my head, moving through the ordinary extraordinary business of figuring out what a galaxy looks like when one of its largest empires has been restructured and the species it underestimated is standing in the room. Because whoever had been in that room, I said, would have made the same decision. Owen looked at me. "You believe that?" "Yes," I said. "I do." He considered it. Then he gave the small, precise nod that meant he had processed something and found it satisfactory. "All right," he said. "Let's go meet the Heravan delegation." We walked through the doors and into the hall, and the sound of the gathering wrapped around us, warm and complicated and alive, the sound of what comes after. Outside, through the station's viewports, the stars were the same stars they had always been. Older than anything we had built, older than any empire that had risen beneath them. They had watched the Vorkai ascendancy grow across 4 centuries. They had watched it meet something it did not expect. They had watched what followed. They would watch what came next. They always did. And we would keep going. That part had not changed and would not change, because it was not a policy or a doctrine or a strategy. It was what we were. It was the decision we made, over and over, in every moment when stopping would have been easier. The thing that grows stronger when you try to break it. The thing that decides.